Thank you for tuning in to the Practical Preservation Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, practicalpreservationservices.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historical home. If you've not done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, and also like us on Facebook. Welcome to the Practical Preservation Podcast, hosted by Danielle and Jonathan Kepperling. Kepperling Preservation Services is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise, balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Today on the Practical Preservation Podcast, we have Sam Slaymaker with us from the Rockford Plantation. Is that the correct organization name, or is it the foundation?
Well, the organization name is the Rockford Foundation.
Okay. Very good. So tell me a little bit about your background.
I was as an undergraduate, I was a history major in college. And then after college, I went to law school, and I practiced law in Lancaster for a good 10 years full time. And during that period, though, I maintained my interest in history, and I volunteered on the boards of several different local historical organizations like the Historical Society, Donegal Society, and Wheatland. And when I was serving on the board of Wheatland, and this was back in, 1999, actually. I sold my partnership interest in the firm that I was in at that time. And I had started, even while I was in practicing law full time, to take classes at Millersville at night towards getting my master's degree in history.
Okay.
And so in the early, around 2000 or so, Wheatland had sort of a staff shakeup. I was the chair of the personnel committee, so I became the acting director of Wheatland. And then, to make a long story short, I then ended up remaining director at Wheatland for, I guess, about 3 years. My wife is also an attorney. She took a position with the U.S. Trustee's office in Georgia, outside of Savannah. So we moved to Georgia for a year. And then about 2005, we came back to Lancaster. And it was that point that I started as a part-time director of Rockford.
Okay.
And then Rockford at that point was only open a few days a week. It wasn't in a very good place. I was practicing law, part-time. I had sort of a niche practice dealing with historic preservation law and real estate. And then eventually I became the full-time director of Rockford, and I have been ever since. So I'm sorry I have to give you such a long answer. But...
Oh, no, that's fine. It's interesting, and it's funny when I ask people that question. A lot of people take a lot of different paths to get to where they are. I think it's more common than not. But there's always usually a central theme.
Right.
So, well, what made you curious about history and preservation?
Well, I think part of it may have been that I grew up at White Chimneys, which is a historic home in Gap, right on Route 30. And that had been in my family for over 200 years. And it was full of artifacts, paintings, And in fact, during the bicentennial, my father, who was also very interested in history and studied history in college, he actually had retired early from the Slaymaker Lock Company and opened up White Chimneys as an historic site. So I I actually kind of, in a sense, grew up above the shop as far as the
Yeah.
historic house museum business goes, because we lived upstairs. That wasn't a tour, but the rest of the house was open in the 1970s. And so that, I think, sparked my interest. I never imagined that. I mean, I thought I was just going to be a practicing law and that was it. I never imagined that, what I had grown up around as a kid was eventually what I'd end up doing. But that's the way
Right.
it worked out.
Well, and that's a very that property does have a lot of history, and that's a very interesting. I don't know if I would think to open up my house as a museum, but
Right, right. Yeah,
but
I
what a
would
great way to share that with the community.
Yeah, at the time, a lot of people thought my father was kind of crazy to do it.
Mhm.
I think his idea was that it was a way of preserving the house for
Yes.
in the future, because then after him and after us, it could just become a museum, and then it would take care of itself. Ultimately, my wife and I lived there for a few years after we were first married, but it became difficult because we were both practicing law in Lancaster, and then we had a young kid at that point, and the house became what I call the tail that wagged the dog, determined everything about our lives. We figured that wasn't good. So ultimately we did end up working with the Historic Preservation Trust in Lancaster, and we put historic facade and open space easements on the house to
Yeah.
preserve it perpetually. And then we worked with the Lancaster Farmland Trust to put easements on the farmland that surround.
Oh, yeah. I didn't realize about the farmland trust. I actually was familiar with the facade easement because the current owners, I do consulting for the trust now, and
Yeah.
I reviewed the change. They just wanted to replace the roof with wood shingles, and I did that review for them in the
Okay.
fall. So I was familiar with the easement.
Good. I
So
think that may have been one of the first easements like that in Lancaster County, or at least that's what they told me at the
well,
time.
I know definitely it's the oldest building that the trust has an easement on.
Okay.
Yeah, because most of the easements were done are in Lancaster City because developers wanted them for the tax credit. So, it's something that is not as widely used as the farm tax credits
Well, it arose out of
or
a
easements.
right, and it arose out of. I mean, there was no great, as far as the facade easement. There was no real tax or financial benefit to,
Right. Yeah.
but it was a way of recognizing our responsibility as the owners and caretakers, really, of this historic property,
Right.
to make sure that future generations would be protected,
Yeah. Yeah.
without
And
us having to just remain the owners and to be the ones taking care of it for the rest
right,
of
right.
our life.
Yeah, and that is something that when I talk to people about like National Trust Register and all those things, as I'm sure you know, that the only thing that really protects a building is an easement.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me a little bit about Rockford, the history of the house, the Hand family.
Okay. Well, Rockford was the home of General Edward Hand, who was Washington's adjutant general during the later years of the Revolutionary War. He was a medical doctor in Lancaster. He had been born in Ireland, actually, in 1744 originally, served in the British Army, and came to America with the British Army as a surgeon's mate or army doctor. He resigned his commission in the British Army in 1774 and then moved to Lancaster and became a doctor in Lancaster. When the Revolutionary War began, he became a lieutenant colonel in the 1st Pennsylvania Regiment, and then served throughout the war at several key battles: Trenton, Princeton, Long Island, so forth. Rose through the ranks, became a brigadier general, and ended up as adjutant general of Washington, and was with Washington as adjutant general at Yorktown. And then when Han returned from the Revolutionary War, he and his family had been renting a house in downtown Lancaster, but in 1785 he purchased about 150 acres, about a mile and a half southeast of downtown Lancaster, in this area along the Conestoga River. It was already locally known as Rock Ford,
Okay.
because there's a ford there to ford the Conestoga,
Mm-hmm.
the Rock. And then he had the house built sometime between 1785 and 1794. And he died in 1802. His family then sold the property in 1810. And it was never occupied by another owner after the Hands. There were tenant farmers that lived
Okay.
there. It was owned by absentee landlords, and that continued up through the 1950s. By 1957, speaking of historic preservation, Rockford was going to be essentially demolished to make room for a municipal incinerator
Oh, goodness.
to be built on the site. And there were a few individuals in Lancaster that thought, well, we should try to find a way to preserve this building. And a lot of people thought they were crazy to do it back then, but they did. And then they joined forces with some ladies from the Junior League of Lancaster, which about 20 years earlier, of course, had played a pivotal and central role in preserving Wheatland. So they'd been through it before. And then they really they formed the Rockford Foundation, which is the nonprofit corporation that exists to this day that still owns and operates Rockford. And Rockford was opened to the public as an historic house museum for the first time in 1960. And it's been continuously open as a historic house museum since then, well, until the shutdown right now.
Right. It's very interesting to me that it was not occupied by the owners since the early 1800s. That probably helped preserve some of the architectural fabric, because people were less likely to put a lot of money into it and try and update it too.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
It's exactly what happened. It left it essentially unchanged.
Yeah. Did
Yeah.
you when they did come in to preserve it, I'm assuming they had to take like did they have to come in and take like plumbing and things out though? Were some of those things added?
Actually, not much.
Okay.
When the tenant farmers lived there, they lived for years with no electricity,
Oh,
or
goodness.
running water. They had a pump.
Mm-hmm.
They lived a very 18th century kind of life.
Yeah.
And I think in the 1950s, one point they did put in some electricity, but very little was done.
Done to
Yeah,
upgrade
so
it.
really
Yeah.
it was kept intact, and I think it's considered to be one of the best preserved examples of original late Georgian style architecture, excuse me, in the country. And that's, as you said, that's exactly why. It's because essentially it was maintained. They did the sort of the minimum of what they need to do to maintain it, but because they didn't live there, they never renovated it, they never modernized it, they
Right.
never Victorianized it or built additions. So
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Very good. And I know that there's a trend, in the house museum business, to start to incorporate, the complexity of American history into telling of the stories. Have you, or how have you included the history of the enslavement into the there's what were there three people enslaved at Rockford?
well, there were, we believe, two,
Two. Okay.
not at the same
Yeah, have you
time.
started to include that into your story, or?
We have, and we include it in the tour, and we talk about it on the website.
Mhm.
And originally, of course, the tendency was well, at all historic sites, really, they didn't
Right.
talk
Yeah.
about it at all, even in the South, really,
Right.
seldom. In the North, it was different because obviously slavery existed in the North, and many people don't know that.
Right.
And they don't know that there were slaves in Lancaster. They have no idea about that. Because Rockford is called Rockford Plantation.
Oh, I could see it. Yeah.
Yeah, that became an issue because people hear plantation now and immediately think about slavery. Ironically, maybe the term plantation in the late 18th century Pennsylvania was just often just used to just mean a farm or large,
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
like they call Plymouth, Plymouth Plantation in Massachusetts.
Hmm.
We do talk about it. We don't know a whole lot. Um, the main enslaved person we know about was named Frank, and we know about Frank because he was listed in the census, I think of 1790 and then 1800, and the slave register. And Frank escaped in 1802, and the hand ran a newspaper ad offering a reward for his return, and that has a description of him in it.
Hmm.
And that's most of what we know about him. There's
Right.
really Hand owned some enslaved people during the Revolutionary War that were at the downtown Lancaster house. There were also some, you know, indentured servants, non-African American indentured servants there too. At Rockford, the records are kind of unclear whether they're indentured servants or not. So
Hmm.
it is something we want to talk about. It's always very challenging
It
because
is.
we feel, obviously it's emotionally difficult,
Hmm.
but it needs to be talked about. And we did actually, about 2 years ago, we worked with the African American Historical Society in Lancaster,
Hmm.
and had numerous discussions with them. And then with our board and volunteers, we had a full day session at the Lancaster History, and just kind of went over all these points, like how we should approach it. We wanted to
Right.
get their input on it because, we have our perspective, but we thought their perspective was probably more important even than
Right.
ours.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've been wrestling with, and one of the things that's difficult is because, again, it's complex in that when we discuss it, we need to discuss it, but we also need to make some distinctions between like a southern plantation where it was really all about, they had hundreds of slaves, and then the
Right.
whole economy was built around it. And then in Lancaster County, where slavery existed, but it existed alongside of indentured servitude and
Right.
all sorts of kind of very hard to understand to us now
Hmm.
arrangements. So it's an interesting topic, and also there's not a lot of records about
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's where a lot, I'm glad that as a country we are starting to talk about the history of, the complete history of the country, because I think that's important to understand where we came from so that we can, help make moving forward better.
it.
But it is hard, and and if you don't have great records, and you don't want to fabricate history either, you want to tell the story. So
Exactly.
I could see those challenges. Definitely. So I know that there's a variety of usages at Rockford, that your current usage. And so we've talked a little bit about the house museum, and you offer tours, and then you have special events, and also, actually one of our previous podcast guests, Wes Swanson, the
Yeah.
brickmaker, yeah, was because I saw an ad for the educational events. And then the also the rentals. So can you tell me a little bit about how the property is being used now?
Yeah. Sometimes I say we're a bit of a three-ring circus, different things going on. Sometimes that are related, sometimes not as closely related. And as we've talked about, of course, Rockford the house is open, for guided tours. So that's kind of our, in a way, that's our raison d'etre. That's how Rockford really started. But then we recognize that's fine for visitors to the area. They've never seen Rockford, but really, to build a constituency and a base of support locally, we recognize it's very important to offer regular programming so that local people have a reason to keep coming back
Right.
and to learn more and to connect with the property and hopefully want to become members and want to support it. And So we've done some collaborative projects, for example, with Theater of the Seventh Sister. We've done these plays, these little short, like one-act plays that they've performed, but based on themes that are historically connected to Rockford, at least. And last year we did a one-act play based on or drawn on from Emma, the Jane Austen play. Now, of course, we're not England and we're not Jane Austen, but we are that period, and the hands were of English descent, and so their lifestyle would have been somewhat similar in many ways to the country gentry of England during that period. And so we felt that that fit, and it had the period dancing. We have a group of volunteers who do period dancing and gave them an opportunity to showcase their skills. We do a number of school programs. We've done some programs with the we're in Lancaster City, which a lot of people don't think realize we're in the southeast corner of the city. So we've done some programs with the school district of Lancaster. One of them you'd mentioned was called the House That Hand Built, and it brought on site some surveyors, Wes Swanson, who showed how bricks were made and how surveyors showed how surveying was done. And the basic premise was like back in the late 18th century, how would Rockford have been built?
Right.
And so it was a chance for the kids to learn about that and to try their hand at surveying as they would have done it back then. I don't completely understand, to be honest with you, but
I know you look through something.
you look through something, and they have these long chains, and to get the right kind of chains, they had to get them from India ultimately, because modern surveyors don't use them, of course, anymore. It's all modern computerized digital
and
equipment.
lasers,
To do the measuring with chains and to get chains that were non-metric, that were the old feet length, was really hard. And one of our volunteer, who was our education coordinator, put it all together. She ordered these chains, finally found them in India, but they had to be shipped in, and she had to go to the Philadelphia airport and pick them up at
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it was unbelievable. And she did all that, and that was a great program. Wes Swanson showed how bricks were made, because bricks at that time, apparently they would make the bricks usually on site.
Yes, yeah.
And so he showed how that would have been done, the surveying for the placement of the house and property, all of it. So when they learn things like that, the house doesn't become so much just an abstraction; it becomes something much more real to them.
Right.
So there's also the other thing, the big aspect we do, of course, to help pay the bills, to keep the cash flowing. We're in the wedding business. And we have a barn at Rockford, which is an 18th century barn that was moved. It was going to be demolished. I think it was in southern Lancaster County. So it was purchased by Rockford for $1 in the 1970s. And then in 1975, it was reconstructed on Rockford, in the site of where Edward Hand's barn was originally, which had since burned down in the 19th century. So the first floor of the barn was built not to be a barn, but it's climate controlled, and essentially it has the old features and charm of the barn, but it's a modern facility that can have meetings and special events. And eventually, years ago, they started renting it, the first floor of the barn, the grounds, and the area around the barn for a tent pad. And wedding receptions and special events are held there, rentals, during the season, usually April through the beginning of November. That's an important source of just operating income. And we have a rental coordinator, but really the rental business, which is very important to our operations, it doesn't have much to do with history or everything else we do, but it does help to pay the bills. It is funny that actually some people are there for weddings, and I think they have no real conception that Rockford is an historic site or what Rockford is. Some people it's really important to them, and that's one of the main reasons they choose to have their wedding there. To other people, it's like, oh, there's this big estate, we get to have our wedding here.
Right.
The beginning of end of the story, which is fine. We do offer, they have an option of having a self-guided house tour during before the reception, after the ceremony, which is nice because then at least they get to see
It
the
gets
house
people,
and
right.
appreciate, well, this is really what this is all about.
Yeah. That's kind of the, I went to probably more than 10 years ago, went to a business side of preservation conference in Vermont. And one concept I took from that was do two things. So like if you're going to rent a facility to have an event, do it at a historic site, because then you're helping preserve it and have your event. So it's, it's that do two things thing. So yeah, if you get people who are into preservation and into history, I could see that being, a draw to them. But it is a beautiful facility also.
Right. We always are very upfront about that in the rentals, that we try, obviously we do everything we can to make sure they have a nice event, but we also make the distinction that, first and foremost, we're a museum and an historic site. And that's why that's why we're here. There are a lot of venues in the past 10 years or so, these barn weddings had become really popular. So people just had a barn and they kind of stripped it down and hung chandeliers in it.
Yes.
Put a big bar in it and did all this stuff, which is fine, good for them.
Mm-hmm.
But then of course, that became, we never used to have that competition. It was Landis Valley had the yellow barn, and then there was Rockford, but now there's all these barns. So we have to to be even in the market, we have to spend a lot of money on advertising, wedding websites, and you just have to do it. And of course, right now, that's another problem with the virus, because all these weddings have had to be pushed back.
Right.
And, but that's everybody's goal.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. Do you see any trends or challenges in preservation from your standpoint?
I guess there always are. One that's been, I think, on the radar pretty much every historic house museum is that history and visitation to historic house museums seems to have really peaked around the time of the bicentennial. And then since then, it's been it declined quite a bit, and then it was hopefully, leveled off a bit. And history, unfortunately, doesn't usually seem to be as much of a priority for schools as it used to be. There's this big focus now on STEM, and which is fine, and nothing wrong with that, obviously. But science, math. We need to do better with science and math. And history seen as sort of a luxury or something for dilettantes. I mean, those of us, and you're one of them too, obviously,
right.
But people that appreciate history recognize that, one, it's really fun and interesting if it's taught well, if people are presented to it.
Right.
But then more importantly than that, of course, as a democratic republic, it's really, really important that the people who are running the country, i.e. ultimately the citizens, have an idea of where we've been as a country, where we've come from,
Definitely.
and how we got to where we are now. And without history, you don't really have a sense of that.
Yeah.
And so we think it is vitally important. And historic house museums are a way to connect, for people to connect directly with it, as opposed to, it's great to read about it, obviously, but there's no substitute for actually being in the place, or being really almost, in a way, going in a time machine and visiting a time that's not long past, but still has resonance, because the Faulkner, the quote about the past is, what is it? Not never really passed. In fact, it's still here, really.
Right. Yeah.
Well, loosely paraphrased.
Well, I think it's very true. There are themes that go throughout history, and they do repeat themselves. I just finished reading a book, The Prairie Fires, and it was about Laura Ingalls Wilder's family.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those themes of, the early 1900s, I could see themes of what we're living through now. And I was like, we all think we're special and we're in this new time period, but we're really not. Everybody's done this before.
Yeah, you're right. The repeating themes and the challenges are, they come in different forms, but there's a lot of similarities, and there's certainly a lot to be learned from what happened, just a working knowledge of what happened before and how it was dealt with and what it led to.
Definitely. So is there anything that you wanted to share that I forgot to ask about?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we covered a lot of ground.
Okay, well, very good. Well, how can someone contact you, contact the organization, schedule? Well, I guess we're waiting to be able to reopen to come visit.
Exactly, and nobody knows exactly when that's going to be at this point. But yes, the best thing I would suggest is that they visit our website at rockfordplantation.org, because it'll give them a lot more information, lots of pictures, I think a drone video of the grounds. Rockford's 33 acres actually, which is kind of interesting. It's pretty, very, but to be able to look at it and learn about what's going on, go to the website. Also, the contact information's on there. If anyone wanted to contact me directly, probably the best way to do it is just my email, which is director@rockfordplantation.org.
Okay, very good. And I'll make ssure all of those links are on our website too, where the podcast will be. So that'll be there. And how can someone support Rockford? I know they can visit, but are there other volunteer opportunities or anything else?
There are, and there's information. There's a section on the website about volunteering, and if you're interested, how to go about doing that, getting in touch with us. And also, as far as supporting Rockford, yes, that's critically important, of course. And the chief way is by becoming a member. And there's a membership section, and I believe you can just do it through the website. You can become a member at different levels, and membership is also a way of the members are really what make Rockford possible, and ultimately, it's really the members that Rockford's all about. So we don't just like to just ask for money. It's basically becoming a part of this place in a very real way.
Well, very good. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for doing this, Danielle. This has been very interesting, and I appreciate you thinking of us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Preservation Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at practicalpreservationservices.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that will get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Practical Preservation Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit practicalpreservationservices.com.